the special broadcast, Summit of the Future. Yes, that is the summit of the United.
भारत की ओर से और 140 करोड़ भारतवासियों की ओर से आप सभी को नमस्कार। जून में अभी मानव इतिहास के सबसे बड़े चुनावों में भारत के लोगों ने मुझे लगातार तीसरी बार सेवा का अवसर दिया है और आज मैं इसी 1/6 ऑफ ह्यूमैनिटी की आवाज आप तक पहुंचाने यहां आया हूं। फ्रेंड्स, जब हम ग्लोबल फ्यूचर की बात कर रहे हैं तो ह्यूमन सेंट्रिक अप्रोच सर्वप्रथम होनी चाहिए। सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट को प्राथमिकता देते हुए हमें मानव कल्याण, फूड, हेल्थ सिक्योरिटी यह भी सुनिश्चित करनी होगी। भारत में 250 मिलियन लोगों को गरीबी से बाहर निकालकर हमने यह दिखाया है कि सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट कैन बी सक्सेसफुल। सक्सेस का हमारा यह अनुभव हम ग्लोबल साउथ के साथ साझा करने के लिए तैयार है। फ्रेंड्स, सक्सेस ऑफ ह्यूमैनिटी लाइज इन आवर कलेक्टिव स्ट्रेंथ, नॉट इन द बैटलफील्ड। और वैश्विक शांति एवं विकास के लिए ग्लोबल संस्थाओं में रिफॉर्म्स आवश्यक है। रिफॉर्म इज द की टू रिलेवेंस। अफ्रीकन यूनियन को नई दिल्ली समिट में G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता इसी दिशा में एक महत्वपूर्ण कदम था। वैश्विक शांति और सुरक्षा के लिए एक तरफ आतंकवाद जैसा बड़ा खतरा है तो दूसरी तरफ साइबर, मैरीटाइम, स्पेस जैसे अनेक संघर्ष के नए नए मैदान भी बन रहे हैं। इन सभी विषयों पर मैं जोर देकर कहूंगा कि ग्लोबल एक्शन मस्ट मैच ग्लोबल एम्बिशन। फ्रेंड्स, टेक्नोलॉजी के सेफ और रिस्पॉन्सिबल यूज के लिए बैलेंस रेगुलेशन की आवश्यकता है। हमें ऐसी ग्लोबल डिजिटल गवर्नेंस चाहिए जिसमें राष्ट्रीय संप्रभुता और अखंडता अक्षुण्ण रहे। डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर शुड बी ए ब्रिज, नॉट अ बैरियर। ग्लोबल गुड के लिए भारत अपना डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पूरे विश्व से साझा करने के लिए तैयार है। फ्रेंड्स, भारत के लिए वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर एक कमिटमेंट है। यही कमिटमेंट हमारे वन अर्थ, वन हेल्थ और वन सन, वन वर्ल्ड, वन ग्रिड जैसे इनिशिएटिव्स में भी दिखाई देता है। पूरी मानवता के हितों की रक्षा और वैश्विक समृद्धि के लिए भारत मनसा वाचा कर्मणा से काम करता रहेगा। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
There you heard Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressing a summit of the future, where a pact for the future has also been adopted, and the Prime Minister saying that India is willing to share its DPI, that is digital public infrastructure, for global good. Prime Minister Narendra Modi also saying that India is ready to share its experiences with the global south. He said that 250 million people have been taken out of poverty in India, and we have shown that sustainable development can be successful. Prime Minister Narendra Modi also spoke about how sustainable development needs to include food security, health security, and people's welfare. He said that the human-centric approach needs to be foremost going forward. And he also spoke about how for peace and development, reforms are needed in global multilateral institutions. He said that they are key to their relevance. And he also, in that context, spoke about the membership of the African Union, or AU, in the G20. Besides that, Prime Minister Narendra Modi also said that global action must match global ambition. He spoke about the challenges to humanity that are posed by terrorism, by cyber, maritime and space conflicts. He said that these have opened new threats besides, of course, terrorism. And Prime Minister also said that technology's safe and responsible use is needed. For that, balanced regulation is required, and that we need global digital governance that respects territorial integrity and sovereignty. And DPI, or digital public infrastructure, should be a bridge and not barrier, while offering India's help in every way possible to share its experiences with regard to digital public infrastructure, or DPI, for global good. Towards the end, he said that one earth, one family, one future is the spirit that guides India, and that is also reflective in an initiative like One Sun, One World, One Grid, wherein grids of around the world are supposed to be interconnected. That's the vision of that initiative, so that there is access to power, that is electricity, around the world. So those are some of the takeaways of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's address to the Summit of the Future at the United Nations headquarters. Remember, it's a two-day summit and pact for the future that also has two annexes, one on a digital economy as well as another on future generations, are also part of that pact of the future. Let's get perspective now. Joining us are Gurjeet Singh, former Ambassador of India to Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, ASEAN and the African Union. Such a pleasure to have you, Ambassador Singh, and also Chitra Subramanian, a well-known journalist, is joining us from Geneva. Your first thoughts, Ambassador Singh. You've heard the Prime Minister. What is on top of your mind at this point in time?
So I think when he said, need global action needs to match global ambition. And then he added several things, which essentially means with global empathy. So I think this global action to match global ambition with global empathy is what he's talking about as part of One India, One World, One Family, and the various host of Indian initiatives over the last several years. I think he rightly pointed out that we need to ensure international peace. We need to deal with non-traditional threats like terrorism, cyber crimes, maritime insecurity. And he rightly pointed out that technology must be harnessed for global good and not be put to bad use. So I think in a very short speech, Prime Minister Modi actually gave a lot of meaning to what the long negotiations on these three documents that you mentioned have done.
Okay. Chitra ji, what do you think is the biggest takeaway from Prime Minister's address?
I agree with the ambassador. I mean, I've noted here basically ambition, the ambition, but be ambitious about everyone's ambition, right? Not just ambitions of a few countries. And I like the way the whole approach has gone for the last two days, that, we're all in this same situation. Nobody is better or worse off. So what I like about is that it's the entire approach has been non-aggressive. We are not aggressive. We are here to make bridges. I mean, he said that we build bridges. We are not here to break down barriers or walls because we don't believe in them. So, I I like this speech. And also I like the fact that he mentioned G20. Because India, without India, where would G20 be? And the pushing of the G20 is important because, there are so many Gs all around the world, but India has played a pretty important role in putting the G20 ambition forward for developing countries. So yes, I think it was, I was very happy to listen to words like ambition, because I think it's time for India. It's India's time, and it's good that our Prime Minister spoke about ambition.
Yes, Ambassador Singh, when we talk of the development paradigm, to borrow from the Prime Minister's words, he spoke of how India has shown that sustainable development can be successful and that so many people have been taken out of poverty in India. And he also spoke about how India is ready to share its experiences with regard to DPI and its other development experiences with the Global South. That's also a pitch that we saw during the G20. Is there a continued effort that the Prime Minister is making to have a very solution-centric approach to contribute in every way possible to the betterment of the Global South, particularly the developing world, and for the betterment of the whole world?
True. So India has among the most successful development cooperation models for the Global South. Whether it is our ITEC program or our collaboration with the African Union or ASEAN or with Central Asia and beyond, Indian model of development cooperation is widely recognized and respected. This is what makes countries of the G7 come to India to undertake trilateral cooperation in the global south. Now, Prime Minister Modi has rightly pointed out that it is this tradition of development cooperation now to which we have added more modern things like India Stack, which has also brought in the DPI. So all this India is ready to offer. And if you see the Quad documents, even there India has offered similar things. So this has become the new alphabet of India's language in engaging with the world. Secondly, the Voice of Global South, which was held twice, before and after the G20 summit last year, was also resorted to by PM Modi and India this year, before this summit of the future. So India comes armed with the passion and the ambitions of the Global South and is articulating them that this is what we want. And here, I think when he talks about the African Union's inclusion in the G20, what he is saying is that what we did at the G20, the UN has been unable to do by making it a more democratic UN and one which is far more inclusive than it was in 1945.
Yes, Chitra ji, when the Prime Minister says global action must match global ambition, and that you said stood out to you, is India leading by example here? Because India is the first responder when it comes to crisis in different countries in the neighborhood and beyond. So is India really leading by example, and is that the leadership that is required in the new world order?
Yes, I mean, I'm not a fan of, I'm not a fan of Global South and Global North, because by definition, it puts you back into some kind of a bracket. And we are, we don't want to be put into any bracket because we'll be doing our own stuff. First responders, yes, remember in Turkey, what happened? We are first responders. I mean, people turn to us. If you look at the UN peacekeeping forces, I mean, India is one of the best. We are the best in the UN peacekeeping forces. We pay our dues. We are there at the top of our game. Anybody who wants the UN peacekeeping forces, they come to us. So I don't like, and kindly bear with me, I don't like this language coming out of the UN where they sort of...
But you are with the spirit.
Pardon?
You are with the spirit.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. But, listen to India, because this is India's time. And if you're not on if you don't understand what India is saying, please make an effort. Because we are here to tell you what all we are doing. But not from a perspective of Global South, Global North, but from a perspective of human beings, from a perspective of ambition, and, the whole multilateral field, because the multilateralism needs help, serious help. And, when you say summit of the future, whose future are you talking about? We have to include everyone. It cannot be global south, global north anymore, because all that that was the language of the,
Right.
it's a language of the past.
But you agree with the overarching vision and the spirit of what was said. Ambassador, coming to you, Prime Minister says reform is the key to relevance. Is that a message to the United Nations itself?
That is indeed a very clear message. And I think a few days ago, we heard the United States representatives talk more specifically about how they could agree to reform of the UN Security Council. And I think in the Quad document, this is also mentioned. The problem here is actually China. China, which used to be a revolutionary power, has become the most status quo power. So all these are actually directed at them, that you can't have reform of the UN system without China, who thinks that they now run it and it works for their advantage, agreeing. So I think this fact that Prime Minister highlighted and emphasized this is very important.
Okay. You agree?
Can I come in on that? Can I come in on
yes,
that,
please do.
You see, yes, the ambassador is right. The problem is China. But hand on heart, nobody wants India in the Security Council, beginning with the P5, and, the P5 of which there's France and the UK sitting in Europe. They're all, in my view, hiding behind China, because, of course, China is the most terrible person there. And there are situations that, China just pulls the mic. Seriously, it pulls the mic when India speaks. But nobody wants change. India will simply have to go and grab the change or be the change. I know for a fact that the UK doesn't want India, the France doesn't want India. And I want to, if I have time, I'd like to narrate a simple incident which highlights the issue. When India became nuclear, when we became a nuclear power, there was a P5 from Europe telling me, but why do you need nuclear power? So I told this person, excuse me, you are a nuclear power. It was a British fellow. So, you are already a nuclear power. France is a nuclear power. You're under the NATO umbrella. We are facing China. So why do you tell us what to do? And then this person was sort of taken aback. Similarly, during a recent debate in Delhi, there was something about India's position vis-a-vis, buying Russian oil, which was a problem. So I asked this person, a problem for whom? And he wasn't able to answer. So you see, the conversation is turning. There is a new appreciation that people are looking at India differently, but we have to move away from the people who made the United Nations what it is, because it's not working.
If you take that issue further, Ambassador, the problem, the elephant in the room is China, and many would believe that even other members of the P5 would not want any other member state to be part of an expanded P5 and share the kind of clout that they have. There are several countries who have spoken against veto power itself. When the Pact of the Future was being adopted, there were countries that did speak out on that. So how does one really go about it? Is there a need for another multilateral system? How does one really make it representative and go beyond words and advocacy?
The Pact of the Future that we are seeing today talks about this reform of the UN system and the multilateral development banks. Now, how to go about it is what India has been saying. We must have text-based negotiations. There is no point just talking of the veto or just talking of who will be in the Security Council. It doesn't work like that. First, you need to have a text which must be agreed upon. Ultimately, the General Assembly would have to amend the Charter. And if the Charter ever got amended for added seats to the United Nations Security Council on a permanent basis, there would be an election and a country would have to win 2/3 votes in the General Assembly. This is the process. So we are all talking about the conclusion of the process without adequately focusing on the start of the process, which is where many hurdles are actually placed in the reform process, whether it's of the working method, the General Assembly, the agencies or whatever. But I think all this is compromising the implementation of the SDGs, which is the greater good that the world is falling back on. So I am not clear how this pact today, while it may give a fillip to multilateralism, will help to get extra financing for the SDGs. And that extra financing for climate change, SDGs, all that remains important. And whatever the developed world puts, they actually choose what to fund, which SDG to fund. Climate change has many people ready to fund it. SDG 8.7, which deals with the welfare of children, has the least amount of funding. And we talk about a summit of the future, and it should all be about children. So you see the contradictions.
Absolutely, there are several contradictions. We'll take this point further, but before that, for a live update, our correspondent Amritpal Singh is joining us from where all the action is, from the United Nations headquarters. Amrit, how was the response to the Prime Minister's address?
Munmun, could you repeat the last part of your question?
How was the response there at the UNGA to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's address? Because like we've seen in the past, this too was very solution-centric.
Oh, yes, of course. You could see from the applause there when Prime Minister finished his address, there was agreement because he made, the points that everybody agrees to. As the ambassadors were saying, the point is how do you go about implementing it? The world may agree on a lot of things, but when it comes to implementation, a real politic takes over. But with the Prime Minister's message that global ambition must match global action, must match global ambition, touched a chord with everybody present in that room. Or when he said that you need to find a human-centric approach to development, to sustainable development, if you have to solve the problems of humanity, everybody agreed to that. Or when the Prime Minister said, we've done it, we've lifted 250 million people out of poverty, and that is a glaring example of how sustainable development can be made successful. So they listened in awe that that is a big achievement, because he said that he stands there representing 1/6 of the world's humanity. So you've not only, it's not just a big talk at a talking shop, but really you have a proven track record. And then he did not, he wasn't, preaching from the perch. He was saying that, look, we are ready to play our part. We are ready to share our digital infrastructure, public infrastructure for collective good with the whole world. We are ready to share our experiences with the global south to address their issues. And he also appealed to the world body and the gathered world leaders that if you want to make any effective change, you need to reform global institutions. So it was really a mix of, putting out what the priorities of the world should be, giving solutions, and offering a commitment that we are ready to play our part in solving the problems, the current problems and the future problems that may afflict humanity. So there was agreement with what the Prime Minister said in the hall there.
Also, Amrit, if I could take this further, the Prime Minister also said that success of humanity lies in our collective strength, not in the battlefield. This, many observers would say, is not an end in itself as a statement, because India is engaged in peace-building efforts between Russia and Ukraine in the conflict that is currently on to put an end to this. Is there a recognition of how India is trying to mediate between the warring sides there at the United Nations? Did you hear from any commentators or any of the principals present there on India's role?
Well, India's offered its part that it can play a constructive part, and it's appealed to the warring sides, to both camps, saying that you cannot find solutions to these problems on the battlefield. It's really a voice of reason. But it really depends upon the two sides whether they want that role to be played. So I think that is a little further. There is no immediate talk of actual nitty-gritty of mediation right now, but that is an offer that India has made if both sides are amenable to that, and appeal as a voice of reason that you cannot find solutions on the battlefield. It has to be, you have to sit across the table, and dialogue and diplomacy is the way forward. That's been India's consistent position, and the Prime Minister once again made a very passionate appeal today at this fora, the Summit of the Future at the UN headquarters, to the world leaders, coming as a voice of reason and appeal with an intent to actually solve humanity's problems through dialogue, and not not the resolution of the conflict through war.
Yes, so we'll come back to you in a bit. Coming to you, Ambassador, now, taking this point forward, India is holding consultations with various interlocutors, and like Amrit said, we need to really wait and see what really comes out of that. But the position that India has taken, that this is not the era of peace, that solution of war rather, and that solutions cannot be found in the battlefield, and now saying that success of humanity lies in our collective strength and not in the battlefield, shows the sincerity of purpose, would you say, with which India is approaching conflicts around the world?
But please remember, peace was a very thick book. It is not a few pages. So when dealing with matters of war and peace, it is time consuming, it takes effort, and I think India is quietly making that effort. You may remember that when the Ukraine crisis started, there was immense criticism among some countries of India associated with Russia. But today there is not only grudging acceptance, there is appreciation that India is the one country which can actually talk in Moscow and in Kyiv like we have shown. But unfortunately, this takes time, a lot of battlefield exercises, and I think what Prime Minister now says, this is really not something to be sorted out in the battlefield, and we must talk about it. We hope that this time will come. But let us not get carried away, because even to get this declaration on the future, there was a battle among diplomats, Ukraine on one side, Russians on the other. Even on this kind of futuristic document, there was the current problem pressing before it could actually be passed. So we have to be careful, but we have to continue to engage all sides and remain neutral, and that will serve the ends of peace in a just manner.
Chitraji, will the catch really be then in the implementation? Because the Pact for the Future has been adopted, like Ambassador was saying, but he also pointed to how implementation may not be as easy around the world. It hasn't been so far, and now we've seen opposition from Russia and a handful of other countries also saying that the Pact for the Future represents Western interests predominantly, and also takes up issues that should be in national jurisdictions.
Yeah, and let us not forget that Europe is in a state of war. There's a war in Europe. I mean, with Ukraine and Russia, it's actually, there's a war in this on the continent, and winter will come in soon. So it's not going to be easy, as the ambassador said. Let's not get carried away. We're talking about a solution, but let's start talking real stuff. Let's get a text. It's one thing to agree and make speeches, but Europe is at war. We're actually having a war at the doorstep of Europe. People are dying. So, and also the United Nations, when it was formed, was a wartime solution. When you look at all the victors said, okay, we have a wartime solution for the United Nations. What India is trying to do is to say, okay, let's try and find a peacetime solution. Now, peace is not absence of war. Let me just clarify that. Peace is also means absence of, engagement in a war-like situation, and that's where I think when you talk about ambition in health, ambition in everything, ambition of, let's say, he talked about energy, ambition in this, and when people grow, when a community is happy and they don't talk about going to war. People talk about going to war when something is deprived, and the Bosnian War was an example of that. People don't generally go to war when their needs are met and everything is okay. So we need to sort of change the conversation, and I think that's happening. And India is leading in that. I think India is playing an important role in that.
Okay. Also, Dr. Swati Rao, a very well-known scholar, is joining us. And I'll thank you, Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, for having joined us with your views. Dr. Swati Rao is already here with us. Such a pleasure to have you, ma'am. But before I come to you, if I could go back to Amrit Pal once. You had a brief conversation, Amrit, a few days ago with a 6-year-old child from India who had come to participate in the Summit of the Future. Does that give us a sense of how representative the consultations have been? And if you could catch up with him again, did he really weigh in any way? He'd written a book on AI, I believe. So, and of course, youth and future generations was one of the chapters of the Pact for the Future. So, has it been representative, particularly when it comes to the youth?
Oh yes, absolutely. And the youth is the focus, because this is the summit of the future, so it impacts the youth. And given that India is a young country, so about 70% population in India is the youth. It is only natural that the youngest, though he was technically a child, he's technically a child, just a 6-year-old, but the very fact that youth are invited here, their views are taken on how they look at technology, how they see they could provide solutions to problems which their previous generations have failed them. And also, when you use up the resources at the pace that we are using up, what do we leave for our future generations? And given that AI, given that the fast-changing technology is finding solutions to problems, so I think the participation of youth, there is a huge delegation of youth from countries, not just youths. In fact, I met a lady just a little while back. They are mothers who have come to participate. They say we are most affected because it is the lives of our children which are at stake. If they do not have clean air to breathe, if they cannot grow up in an environment that's peaceful, if they are resource starved, if there are glaring inequalities that exist, then we have to assert them ourselves, if not for anything else, but for the future of our children. So it is quite an inclusive process. In fact, what you saw yesterday by adoption of the pact was an exercise which took about 9 months. First proposed in 2021 by, last year by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the UN. Then, a wide consultation process took place around the world, and finally we saw the adoption of those pacts. But the key question remains the implementation of that of those principles agreed in that pact.
Right, Prit, would request you to stay on with us. Coming to you, Dr. Rao now. Now, if you look at the Pact of the Future, Dr. Rao, it talks about the need to make the UNSC more representative of the 21st century. And if you hear the Prime Minister, he says reform is the key to relevance. So India, developing countries, even the UN Secretary General, they are all on the same page. The Pact for the Future, which has been adopted by 140 odd countries voting in favor, they are all on the same page. Yet, nothing concrete is moving forward. So what do you think is going wrong, and how can there be course correction?
A very good evening to you, Munmun. And yes, I think it's a classic paradox. It's a classic paradox that we have faced just so many times in the evolution of the United Nations systems. I mean, let's understand that at the heart of it is an effort to bring back effective multilateralism. I mean, I was just hearing the discussion that was going on, and of course the United Nations has not been able to rise up to the occasion. The United Nations Security Council remains pretty much a paralyzed body because of this veto system out there, which is also very extremely unrepresentative, extremely unegalitarian of how the world is today. there is no doubt everywhere you go, and when you speak about the United Nations, we need to basically reform the body which is at the core of its conflict prevention and conflict resolution, which is basically the Security Council. And it only reflects the post-1945 world order. It does not really reflect the world order that we live in today, which is exceedingly getting multipolar. So at the heart of it, I think it is an ambition, it is an effort, and I think a sincere effort at that. When the proposal first came from the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and this came about 2-3 years ago. This is not last year, if I'm not wrong. This came around 2021, if I'm not wrong. But he was very forthright in calling it once in a generation opportunity to reshape human history, fostered by international cooperation. But lo and behold, just as he spoke those very beautiful, wonderful, grand sounding words, you saw what happened, and this was around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, everybody was understanding how important international cooperation was. And then beginning of 2022, the world was yet again fractured and bifurcated, even more because of what was happening in the Russia-Ukraine situation. And right now, as we speak, the war is inching forward to its third year. There are fault lines, the fault lines are deepening. There are issues that everybody understands are impacting the entire global situation, and that is where India stands come in. And we have spoken about it so many times, Munmun, that India has had a very stable and India has a very consistent approach. But the point that needs to be understood is that we are living in an era of fractured multilateralism. And if we want to fix that, fractured multilateralism, I think it is very good to have a grand plan. I think, in my understanding, this is more like a grand strategy. It is more like a reference point. I am not sure how much of it can be implemented, because I very much agree with the argument that how do you talk about implementing these grand plans for the future when at the heart of international engagement there are fault lines which are deepening as we are speaking. Okay. So, and it is not just the Russia-Ukraine situation, it's also what is happening in the West Asian situation, and what we are all gearing up and all sort of crossing our fingers against is the Taiwan crisis. So the world is an exceedingly dangerous place. It's becoming more militarized, but at the same time, I think the best way to look at this is that there is a majority of states in the international system that agree to the fact that we need a grand strategy, we need a grand solution to come out of the mess that we've created for ourselves. Okay. And each one of us have a role to play there. And of course, the way I say it, I would always come back and conclude with the position of where our country is, which is absolutely a very credible, peace-loving country. I was just hearing what the Prime Minister said in about 15 odd minutes, and I think he just actually
Dr. Rao, we'll play that speech again for our viewers. So let's listen to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's full address to the UN Summit for the Future.
एक्सेलेंसीज, विश्व के सबसे बड़े लोकतंत्र भारत की ओर से और 140 करोड़ भारतवासियों की ओर से आप सभी को नमस्कार। जून में अभी मानव इतिहास के सबसे बड़े चुनावों में भारत के लोगों ने मुझे लगातार तीसरी बार सेवा का अवसर दिया है, और आज मैं इसी 1/6 ऑफ ह्यूमैनिटी की आवाज आप तक पहुंचाने यहां आया हूं। फ्रेंड्स, जब हम ग्लोबल फ्यूचर की बात कर रहे हैं तो ह्यूमन सेंट्रिक अप्रोच सर्वप्रथम होनी चाहिए। सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट को प्राथमिकता देते हुए हमें मानव कल्याण, फूड, हेल्थ सिक्योरिटी यह भी सुनिश्चित करनी होगी। भारत में 250 मिलियन लोगों को गरीबी से बाहर निकालकर हमने यह दिखाया है कि सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट कैन बी सक्सेसफुल। सक्सेस का हमारा यह अनुभव हम ग्लोबल साउथ के साथ साझा करने के लिए तैयार है। Friends, success of humanity lies in our collective strength, not in the battlefield. और वैश्विक शांति एवं विकास के लिए ग्लोबल संस्थाओं में रिफॉर्म्स आवश्यक है. रिफॉर्म इज द की टू रिलेवेंस. अफ्रीकन यूनियन को नई दिल्ली समिट में G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता इसी दिशा में एक महत्वपूर्ण कदम था. वैश्विक शांति और सुरक्षा के लिए एक तरफ आतंकवाद जैसा बड़ा खतरा है, तो दूसरी तरफ साइबर, मैरीटाइम, स्पेस जैसे अनेक संघर्ष के नए नए मैदान भी बन रहे हैं. इन सभी विषयों पर मैं जोर देकर कहूंगा कि ग्लोबल एक्शन मस्ट मैच ग्लोबल एम्बिशन. फ्रेंड्स, टेक्नोलॉजी के सेफ और रिस्पॉन्सिबल यूज के लिए बैलेंस रेगुलेशन की आवश्यकता है. हमें ऐसी ग्लोबल डिजिटल गवर्नेंस चाहिए जिसमें राष्ट्रीय संप्रभुता और अखंडता अक्षुण्ण रहे. डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर शुड बी ए ब्रिज, नॉट अ बैरियर. ग्लोबल गुड के लिए भारत अपना डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पूरे विश्व से साझा करने के लिए तैयार है. फ्रेंड्स, भारत के लिए वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर एक कमिटमेंट है. यही कमिटमेंट हमारे वन अर्थ, वन हेल्थ और वन सन, वन वर्ल्ड, वन ग्रिड जैसे इनिशिएटिव्स में भी दिखाई देता है. पूरी मानवता के हितों की रक्षा और वैश्विक समृद्धि के लिए भारत मनसा वाचा कर्मणा से काम करता रहेगा. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद.
Amrit, coming to you before we let you go, we've seen how India has come up with various path-breaking initiatives like the International Solar Alliance, or ISA, or the CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative. And we've also, during our G20 presidency, offered our digital public infrastructure, particularly for the developing world. So when the Prime Minister says global action must match global ambition, is India leading by example here, and is there recognition at the world stage of India's contribution?
Absolutely. You know, the Prime Minister listed these things out. He's in fact made an offer that we are ready to offer our digital, sharing our digital public infrastructure with the world. The initiatives you mentioned, the International Solar Alliance, one thing which skipped was the vaccine metri. When the world was affected by COVID and people were dying all around, such a huge population like India, while India took on the world's biggest vaccination drive for its own people, it offered vaccines to countries of the global south, and even sent medicines to the developed world, including the United States of America. So India has always been, a part of the solution and offering the solution. Yesterday at the diaspora event, Modi and US, he made that point that we only contribute a very minimal part to the carbon emissions of the world. We are not a problem, we are not a part of the problem, we are really a part of the solution. And that is what I think the Prime Minister's appeal was, that it's all very well to talk about prosperity of humanity, of having ambition, but what is required is action. I think his passionate appeal was that we need to take action, we need to end the conflicts, and then he also warned that these conflicts really have the threat, a real threat of spilling over into the cyber domain, spilling over to the maritime domain, into space. He said while technology will provide us solutions, we must explore technology and invest in technology to bridge the divide, the development divide between the developed world and the underdeveloped world, etc., remove poverty. But we need to also be aware of the misuse of technology, and therefore he appealed for a balanced regulation of technology and the need for a global digital governance architecture to maintain sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries, of the welfare of people living in these countries.
Yes, we'll take that point on technology that you made further, but we'll thank you for now. Amritpal, appreciate you joining us with your inputs. And joining us now is also Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, former Indian ambassador. He's served as Consul General in New York as well in the past. Well, Ambassador, such a pleasure to have you as well. And the point that Amritpal was making towards the end on the need to have balanced regulation for safe and responsible use of technology. He spoke of how the Prime Minister said that we need such global digital governance architecture that respects territorial sovereignty, integrity, and that DPI or digital public infrastructure should be a bridge and not a barrier. In the present context, how relevant is the pitch for ethics and regulation to match technology?
Well, first of all, Manmohan, thanks for having me on your show. I think it's extremely relevant what the Prime Minister said about bridging this gap. And I think he also was very categorical in saying that India is willing to share the experience and the success which it has had with developing countries. And I think that sent out a very important message that the need of the hour is to share and help in upliftment. The Prime Minister very categorically mentioned his belief in one world, one family, one future, and how this has impacted India's approach on a whole host of issues. In fact, on every global issue, that is the approach we are taking, and we try to send this message to our presidency of the G20 when we adopted as our agenda Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, our theme. Now, the Prime Minister spoke for just 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes were so rich in content. I think he highlighted the most important things which matter in today's world, starting off with, firstly, reforms. He very categorically said that reform is the key to relevance, and if we look at the multilateral system, certainly reforms in global institutions are important. Then, of course, he emphasized the human-centric approach, and that is very relevant in today's day and age when there is such digitalization taking place that sometimes we feel that certain sections of humanity are being left behind. And that is why he mentioned that it's important that countries should prioritize humanity and adopt a human-centric approach to ensure that they achieve sustainable development. And then, of course, he pointed out how India has been able to uplift 1/6 of humanity out of poverty, and how we are willing to share this experience with other countries, particularly the countries of the global south. This need to share is very important, and I think this is the message when across. But of course, he didn't miss the opportunity to point out how terrorism remains such a serious threat to global peace, and things like cyber, maritime, space, all these are impacted by current global developments and are emerging as the new theater of conflict. So I think that was a very, very compact but significant message that he sent out through his 5-minute speech.
I'll take that point further with Chitra Subramaniam ji. Chitra Subramaniam ji, what do you make of the emphasis on responsible use of technology? Because in the current times, there's always a threat of its weaponization. There is a threat of use of nuclear weapons too. And the Pact for the Future mentions that there is a broad agreement to have nuclear disarmament in the next few years. How significant is this in the current times?
Well, I think it's extremely significant, and I do want to bring in this fact about India has always said that if we go back to the negotiations in Geneva on a comprehensive test ban treaty, India basically said that too was discriminatory. You see I insist how discriminatory the entire approach of the UN has been to let's talk a nuclear issue, or saying that the P5 have a special approach and the rest have a special approach, whether it is disarmament, whether it is conventional disarmament or nuclear disarmament. The entire thing is rigged against countries for a new rigged against countries who do not agree with the UN. And I was sort of a ground reporter then when the comprehensive test ban treaty negotiations were going on in Geneva, and India refused to sign it because it put India on a permanent spiral of dependence. Same thing for a lot of nuclear discussions. So the threat is real. The threat is very real. Let's not pretend that. But then the threat of accidents are even perhaps more real than the threat of a country going out and killing. The threat of accidents is what we have to worry about. So that's my position.
Yes. Dr. Rao, what do you make of Prime Minister's intervention? The Pact for the Future mentions that there is a broad agreement among various countries to avoid weaponization and misuse of new technologies such as lethal autonomous weapons, an affirmation that laws of war should apply to many of these technologies as well. We've seen misuse of technologies for conflicts and wars in the past, and there's always a potential of that. There's always a potential also of nuclear conflagration, unfortunately, in conflicts when they go out of hand. So how significant is that intervention?
Well, that intervention is pretty significant. I mean, coming from India, there are both, pluses and minuses that we need to sort of assess. The pluses are that, like I said, that when you live in a world which is mired by conflict and unending conflict, and when you see that it's basically the big powers of the world that are involved in it directly or indirectly. I mean, it probably is left to the rest of the world to actually brainstorm methods and modus operandi, etc., to actually think about how to lessen the global suffering. And one of the ways in which you can do is, of course, the Prime Minister has made it very, very clear. As far as implementation is concerned, there are a couple of things that I'd like to, of course, highlight here. One is that, yes, it's good to have a grand strategy, a kind of a reference point that I was discussing earlier. But at the same time, one has to believe in practical solutions. And one of the reasons why India's voice is so credible is because India has always come up with practical solutions, right? So we will come to, come to technology later, because India right now is not really a technological, power. It is a technological power in making, perhaps, but it's not a technological power at par with the US or with some of the European countries. But at the same time, these are countries that are right now championing the regulation of it. Some days ago, if you remember, Munmun, there was just this hue and cry over banning of Telegram, and when you got into the details of it, you kind of realized that the way the algorithm was set in that particular app kind of enabled for all that anti-children content to be traded, and all the illegal terrorist activities and all the gory videos and all the other transnational crimes. It became a kind of a safe haven for that. So and when you got into the detail, we also realized that now there are countries in the West, if you especially look at the EU digital law, it is now becoming more and more restrictive. So of course, on the one hand, there is always this classic paradox of free speech versus digital authoritarianism, and India right now is in the middle of that flux where India understands the dangers of it. I mean, we have taken generally a conservative view, but at the same time, we do not want to blindly follow in line of what, for example, the Western powers would say, what the European digital law would say, or what happens in the US. But at the same time, let's just understand that we are in the middle of a world, or we are in the middle of this very fluid time when the emerging global digital order needs to be nailed, needs to be defined, needs to be regulated. And whoever is becoming a kind of a partner for these tasks will eventually then dominate the global economic order and the global security order. And now you can no longer talk about these areas as watertight compartments. These are not operating as silos, especially with the advent of technology. So I think to be conservative is fine, but like I said, that you are in a way, when we're speaking about this, you are looking for a black cat in a dark room. And the point is that you have to somewhere, come together with like-minded countries and partners. So this is definitely a question which does not have an easy answer. That there is intent is of course good news, but how would you implement it? I will say taking small steps is perhaps the answer. But coming back, there's one thing that I would definitely like to say where India has always stood its ground about giving practical solutions. If you remember the G20 days, and everybody was speaking about famine and hunger and world hunger and all the food crisis that was emerging from the Russia-Ukraine war. India kind of championed the use of millets and said that if you go into the details of how millets really solve the world hunger problem, we need to mainstream that a little bit more. And if you remember the G20 days, if you remember the menus, if you remember all of that, you really saw that India stood up to that commitment and really, mainstreamed millets and mainstreamed the discussion around millets and all of that. So these are, little small steps that you can take, come up with practical solutions. If you remember the Biofuel Alliance, if you remember the International Solar Alliance, if you remember how the Prime Minister has given these really, I would say, path-breaking ideas in a very simple language that a common person on the street can connect and understand, like a pro-people planet approach. Those kind of things are actually what we really require in the world today. Because, like I said, that it's not just about giving statements, it is also about having the credibility that the rest of the people are going to listen to you, because you speak from a position of empathy, and you speak from a position of having years in your kitty when you have fought for their rights. And the last thing, I think it's these kind of innovative solutions. I think innovative solutions is pretty much the flavor of the Indian discourse, especially when we've engaged with foreign partners. And this particular term stood out when the Prime Minister went to Ukraine and when the joint statement said that India is looking for innovative solutions. I think these kind of innovative solutions are what we require, which need resilience, which need kind of an introspection, which also needs an engaging, sustaining communication with all your partners. So right now, if you do see that there are certain countries that are not falling in line, that are sort of not supported it, the idea is to not to look at it as a fault line. The idea is to actually engage them in communication and engage them in a conversation, because these kind of conversations are what will actually define where we are going in terms of the grand strategy, which remains a reference point. So, and I think India is the best conversationist out there, to actually shape these conversations, keeping in mind the very obvious fact that India doesn't have, that kind of funds, or India cannot really do it alone. Actually, nobody can do it alone, So we were looking for people who can take the leadership, who have the legitimacy, and I'm very sure that India definitely is one of those actors in the world today.
Right. One question on the UNSC reform I would like to take with you, Ambassador. But before that, Chitra ji, your thoughts on what the Prime Minister said on terrorism. He said that terrorism is a challenge to humanity, but there are new theaters also coming up. Cyber conflicts, maritime conflicts, space conflicts, they've opened new theaters. India, you would remember, in the late 1990s had pitched for a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. For several years in the last decade, we have pitched for a CCIT. I also happened once to interview the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, and he said that we don't have a CCIT because there's no agreement on the definition of terrorism, because one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. So then how do you really go forward when there is lack of commonality on a basic definition?
It's a very good question, Munmun. There is no, they haven't even agreed on what is human rights. Let's go back. From Geneva, there's a huge discussion on what is human rights. So this comes back to the entire, the multilateral system needs to do some very deep thinking. They don't know what terrorism is, they can't decide. And let truth be said, so many of the countries sitting around, are basically backing terrorism, in action or in their speeches. They turn a blind eye to terrorism, and we look at what's happening in Gaza. We look at, it's a basic crisis. We are living at a moment of deep crisis, and I can't stress that more. I mean, this was the year of celebration of democracy. 64 countries went to vote, as almost 50% of the world. But never has democracy been so threatened. If you say that, I was recently at a conference in Yerevan, Armenia, and you're looking at democracy as a global good. And what is being threatened by it's terrorism that is threatening a democracy. And then we get into a definition of terrorism. Would we really come down to asking a very basic question? Why doesn't the UN have a pact? But even if it were to have a pact, how would we implement it? Where is the money? So it's all very nice to talk about this, that, and the other, but we would need money. And I come back to what the lady before me was saying, that innovation is important because innovation doesn't have to be costly. So that's the way to go, maybe. Let's not have money, because we're never going to have enough money to do anything, including fighting terrorism, because terrorism has enormous amounts of money. Someone told me the bad people get the money, the good people don't get the money. They were talking about the Taliban. So we will never have enough money to do the good. So let's look at innovation, come together as a country, and all the more reason why, we need to be ambitious about innovation. So that answers your question.
Right. I'll take the point on UNSC reform forward with you, because there are so many things that the Prime Minister spoke on. He spoke about the need for reform to ensure relevance. Ambassador Dayal, you would remember that some months back when Ruchira Kamboj was India's permanent representative to the United Nations, she said that India is presenting a model on behalf of the G4 for UNSC reform, and she said that India is pitching on behalf of G4 reform in both permanent and non-permanent categories. Interestingly, countries were not mentioned. Some continents and regions were mentioned. So Latin America was mentioned, Asia Pacific, Africa, Caribbean, Western European and other states were mentioned. Eastern Europe was mentioned for both inclusion in permanent and non-permanent categories. And I was looking at what the Pact of the Future contains. The Pact of the Future says that it is an agreement now between 140-odd countries to redress the historical underrepresentation of Africa as a priority. These are commitments or affirmations that we've heard many times over, but time is running out and many people are questioning the very legitimacy of the United Nations. Do you think that there would be any forward movement, say by 2030, sooner or later?
You have rightly said that there is a lot of talk about these issues. Countries speak of the need to reform. Various proposals are put forward, including by the G4. The problem is that there are impediments. For instance, in the context of the G4, there was the obstruction by the so-called Coffee Club, which was very keen to make sure that these G4 countries didn't make it to the permanent membership of the UN Security Council. Now, the Pact of the Future, which you were just showing on your screen and to which you referred, says that the leaders have undertaken to transform global governance and reinvigorate the multilateral system to tackle the challenges and seize the opportunities of today and tomorrow. Because everybody realizes that the UN Security Council in its present form has not been able to cope up with the present-day global challenges. There is a need for reform, and in fact, the Prime Minister himself very categorically said that reforms are so relevant in today's day and age. There are impediments, as I said. Now, for instance, China is a very major impediment. China does not want, for instance, India to come into the UN Security Council. China plays a very obstructionist role. And I'm afraid that the UN Charter itself complicates reform. So unless the countries of the world get together and convince each other that the UN Charter should be reformed, because otherwise the UN Charter says that the reform can only take place if all the P5 members agree to any particular reform act. So if there is to be an increase in the membership of the Security Council, all the 5 permanent members have to agree. Now that becomes the problem. At the same time, since the Security Council is really not being able to live up to present day challenges, everybody, every right-thinking person feels that there is a need to reform it. So sooner or later, the reform will take place. We have tabled proposals in regard to the reforms so many times, and these have been discussed. Most countries agree, but still, due to the obstructionist nature of certain forces, these reforms are not able to get through.
Now, when we talk of reform, Dr. Rao, and reformed multilateralism, we are not just referring to the UNSC, though it is the most important world body in terms of the clout that it wields, but there is also reform of the international financial architecture. And the Pact for the Future says that developing countries, it's been decided they'll have a greater say in how decisions are taken at the international financial institutions, and there'll be more finance that will be mobilized from multilateral development banks to help developing countries meet their development needs. Now, this was part of the New Delhi Declaration as well, the G20 Declaration. It's been a constant advocacy from the developing countries, including India. I remember even the Indonesia Declaration had it, the Bali Declaration, and now the Brazil Declaration might also have it. What really happens going forward? There is a broad agreement, but how do you put this into action?
Yeah, so first of all about the G20, so I think it probably would be useful to sort of just remind everybody that and freshen up everybody's memories about the wonderful G20 year that we had, is that also the G20 presidency and the G20 agenda actually forms and runs through a troika, right? So there are like 3 countries together that sort of finalize that one troika with the president in the middle, and the outgoing and the incoming one, on the side, and the agenda that you see. So when you were speaking about continuity of that agenda is also because of the structure that the G20 has. So that's the first thing. The other thing about making it more egalitarian, yes, of course. I mean, one of the reasons why the world has had such a skewed growth pattern, one of the reasons why distribution in the world remains so skewed, one of the reasons why globalization failed to somewhere rise up not just to the needs of the people that were poorest of the poor, lot of the populations, but also perpetuated climate crises and all these kinds of negative things that we see, was because the things were not really equitable, things were not really equal, they were not thought through properly. And one of the things that India has been doing, and it's not just India, I think India is also joined by a lot of like-minded countries, it's about how to make these things much more egalitarian. And India takes a lot of pride, and I think rightly so, in trying to make this entire discourse around special drawing rights, for example, more egalitarian, for making the vaccines, the vaccine diplomacy that India championed was also about the same egalitarianism. And you will see that whether it's climate, I mean, what is the biggest thing today? This is how the Western economies, the developed economies think and act about their climate goals, for example. You would see that there is just so much focus and so much diplomatic effort around making the climate transition. You see that there's been a Greens parties that have been doing so well across Europe. Only this time in the election they did not do so well because of the rising cost of the reality that the Russian-Ukraine war brought. However, what I'm trying to say is that there is a lot of international push and pressure on accepting the terms of the climate transitions that the Western economies find okay and preferable for themselves. But at the same time, developing economies know that this is not going to work given the kind of level of development that their economies are operating into, and there can only be a phasing down of the fossil fuel and not the phasing out of the fossil fuel as the Western economies want. And there has been a lot of struggle, on this, and India has always led such struggles. So that is what I'm saying. I mean, India's, as far as the credibility quotient is concerned, I think India's credibility quotient has always been high. But about implementation and effort, and I think that's one thing that everybody understands that very clearly, that listen, you can either take the China way, so you can come with a checkbook, right, and sign one island up or sign a connectivity project for the next 90 years. I don't know whether you deliver or you're not, but you land into troubles, or the Chinese give you so much money that you cannot pay back, and this entire debt trap and all that. And the way the BRI actually materialized in the world, and the world woke up to the insecurities, and the world woke up to the risks, therein with the BRI kind of lending. And on the other hand, yes, there is an acknowledgement that yes, with more open systems, there will always be a problem to de-risk capital, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the Russia-Ukraine war, and then what happened in West Asia and its spillover in the Red Sea, which has made the international maritime, commerce so much more expensive, and insurance around it so much more expensive. Now, what I'm saying is that, now I think there is fair amount of understanding, fair amount of clarity, that either you come with a checkbook and deep pockets and then just, sign on something, and nobody knows what really happens to that, and nobody knows what the real terms and conditions of that are, or you get into a collaborative framework with like-minded countries where the delivery of those funds could be slow, but at the same time, you will always have a more collaborative approach to de-risking the capital, to making it more sustainable, and to also have more say in that. Because one thing that has happened in the world, Munmun, is that the Western and the developed world understands that they cannot really pursue the agenda that they wish to follow, whether it's a security agenda, the digital agenda, whatever agenda that may be, without the participation of the Global South. Of course, we can discuss how do we define the Global South, and I myself do not agree with this term, because this could be Global South is not a monolith either, right? And you know that India and China compete, for who is really the leader of the Global South. If you read the Chinese discourse, they just provide a very alternative viewpoint of what the Global South really is, and they sort of put themselves in the center. But of course, that's not really the discourse the rest of the world buys. And like I said, that there is a fair amount of realization that if today's solutions need to work, if today's frameworks need to work, the economic frameworks need to work, you need to make them more equal, you need to make them more, conversational, and then you really cannot go anywhere, or you cannot get too far without the proper involvement of, these countries. And if you see, from right across the board, whether it's a Build Back Better World, whether it's an IPEF, whether it's an EU Indo-Pacific Ministerial Summit, whatever that may be, right, you would always see that there is just so much talk about how do you build these connectivity, these multimodal connectivities, how do you sort of, incorporate the green financing, how do you, get into lending mechanisms which actually deliver. So I think there is a lot of work that is going on. When will it start to show real impact? I think it's a question of time. I don't think it's a question of intent really, but it's a question of time, and it's also a question of how do we really coordinate our response towards these wars which have become unending. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty much, we end from where we begin, which is that, yes, the world needs to stabilize for these things to show effect, and I think that's perhaps my biggest.
Yes, please go ahead, Chitraji.
I was just continuing what Dr. Swati was saying, that, COVID was quite a teacher in more ways than one. COVID actually showed this China checkbook diplomacy, just called them out. I mean, the world was so dependent on China that the West just had it. There were no bandages, there were no syringes, and suddenly they realized that this China had literally, taken over the economy, whether it was manufacturing, whether it was delivery of food. The European Union, China just buys off ports, so they actually influence human rights. At the Geneva, in UN and Geneva, because they have brought ports in rings. So these are all coming up for question. COVID dependency on China, nobody wants to depend on China. And where I think, and I said this yesterday as well, India is a democracy. It is a democracy, and that's a strength. When I think it was yesterday when the Prime Minister was speaking to the diaspora, he said that 17% of the world it's not polluting. We haven't polluted the world as they are being made to feel. And these numbers are important because you absolutely need to talk about these numbers. And when you look at the whole thing, I mean, COVID was a very important teacher in more ways than one. It showed that this checkbook diplomacy of China is not going to work. And Europe learned a very, very strong lesson because they were entirely dependent on China for a whole lot of things.
And which is why the emphasis on diversification and resilience of supply chains, which we saw in the Quad as well, and we see in various bilateral partnerships as well. Now, on the question of climate change also that Chitraji referred to, Ambassador, I'll come to you. The Pact for the Future says that countries have agreed to accelerate measures to address climate change, to deliver more finance, to help countries adapt to climate change and invest in renewable energy. Now, COP after COP, we look at how various presidents talk about the need to have a new climate fund, a green climate fund. There was much earlier a commitment made of giving $100 billion to developing countries from the developed world every year until 2025. Not much progress has been made there. What does this commitment on paper in the Pact of the Future really mean? Do you think that this is something which is very full of earnest, or do you think that this is just something which may not really be executed as much as we would like?
The Pact of the Future has very good ideas, but as you have hinted, what is needed is implementation. It should not just remain a pact on paper. There should be actual implementation so that those who are in need of assistance through the multilateral system can get that assistance. Now, my earlier intervention spoke about the need for reforming the UN Security Council and the impediments, because that was in the context of what you said regarding the G4. But as regards transforming the overall global governance system to meet all challenges which have arisen now and which are going to arise tomorrow, there is a need to reform and transform the global governance and also reinvigorate the multilateral system in a variety of ways. For instance, the multilateral system should be able to respond to the needs of developing countries and give direct financing to the countries most in need. At the moment, unfortunately, that is not happening. Then there is a need to reform the international financial architecture so that countries can borrow sustainably in order to be able to invest in their long-term development. That also is not happening very satisfactorily. And then, of course, there is the need to accelerate the reform of the international financial architecture so that it can strengthen the capacity to support developing countries more effectively and protect them from systemic shocks and make the financial system more stable. Developing countries are most vulnerable to shocks. They suffered immensely during the Depression. And any sort of financial upheaval that takes place impacts the developing countries of the global south very directly. So the multilateral system has to take care of, measure how these global south countries should be protected. And I think our Prime Minister also spent out some of his thoughts on that process.
Yes, I want to take up the issue of pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. Chitraji, you were referring to that in your earlier answer, and the Pact for the Future is calling for the formation of an emergency platform for three things. One is managing pandemics, the other is food insecurity, and that reminds us of India's advocacy of millets, particularly during its G20 presidency, which are so high on nutrition, and also environmental disasters, and we see that so often. But if we stick to pandemic management, and you are in Geneva where the WHO headquarters is, the WHO still doesn't know what the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic was, because one country did not participate, did not let WHO inspectors go to the Wuhan laboratory where it was suspected that the slippages happened. So, how does really one move forward on an emergency platform when there is no multilateralism on which all countries are on board? Because when you think you are caught on the wrong foot, you simply refuse to cooperate.
And you just put your finger on the problem. I mean, the bad news is that the pandemic preparedness, they were trying to negotiate a treaty, which just didn't come through prepared. I mean, it's just, it's sad. It's sad that we're living in a situation where we can't even agree on what's a pandemic, because they argued about the definition of a pandemic at the WHO. So, this is where we're looking. We're not prepared for a pandemic, and I'm sorry to say this, that the world is not prepared for the kind of pandemic, and the next one is going to be even worse. And I don't want to say be scary, and having worked with the WHO, one is not supposed to say scary things, but it's not a comfortable situation. The pandemic preparedness is linked to money, but it's also linked to information. And we don't have the kind of information that we should have had. As you said, we couldn't go to the wet markets, the Chinese wet markets, so no one could go there. Then you sort of had secondary information, right? Laboratories here, there. But then also, which country was the worst hit in the beginning? It was Italy. It was north of Italy, where you had people just dying like flies. If you look at north of Milan, there were these gun carriages. They didn't want to talk about it. I mean, there were these what's called post-commune, when bodies were put into trucks and they were going through these villages at night. It was absolute chaos. And yet, they hadn't yet declared a global emergency. The WHO did not want to declare a global health emergency because China wouldn't allow it. And China is a major financer at the WHO. So, it's terrible to say these things, but that's a reality, Manmohan. We are living with this, not just checkbook diplomacy, checkbook, but we're also living with China as a major power at the WTO, which is a World Trade Organization. Who's the boss? It's China. And they don't talk about it. They're very, very quiet. That's how they move. The Chinese are very quiet. And the bad news is that no one is prepared for the next pandemic. I'm sorry to say this, but that's a reality.
No, absolutely. Truth be told, like we say. Towards the end, just closing comments from the three guests here on what do you expect from Dr. Jaishankar's statement going forward. He'll be presenting or delivering India's national statement at the UNGA high-level week in a few days from now. The theme for this year is leaving no one behind, acting together for advancement of peace, sustainable development and human dignity for present and future generations. Dr. Rao.
Well, yes, I mean, from Dr. Jaishankar, I do expect that on the one hand, there will be continuity, of course, about India's stand, which has been very consistent from the beginning. And when I say India stand on basically, a couple of things. The first is on the United Nations Security Council reform. I think they will speak about that. Then about, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war. If you see that slowly, you will see a lot of repeated reiterations, in fact, from the Indian side, whether it's the Prime Minister's remarks generally in different countries, in Russia and Ukraine, in the West, in the US, when he spoke, also in the joint statements, when you read them carefully, where you see that there has been India's stand has been about a commitment to UN Charter and international law and territorial sovereignty, etc., etc. So I think these kind of things will continue. We will see an echo of that from Dr. Jaishankar as well. But like I said, the flavor of the season for me, I think, has been on innovative solutions. So I would be interested, and Dr. Jaishankar is just the right person to actually come up with the right kind of innovative solution in the most simplest possible language at all times. So I would perhaps see him building on how far India has come and what is India looking at in the future as it goes forward. So that would be my expectations for Dr. Jaishankar.
Yes, Chitra ji, coming to you on the same.
So I'm a fan of Dr. Jaishankar, and I very carefully follow his itinerary because, he's all over the world. He's sort of here, he's there. I mean, he's like a weaver. He weaves and weaves and weaves and weaves. It's remarkable how this top diplomat weaves. So I have expectations, but I wouldn't dare say them now. And I'm hoping that he'll say something very innovative and something splendid. And I'll leave that.
Okay, Ambassador, last word to you.
Well, as regards this overall theme of sustainable development and implementing the 2030 agenda which the United Nations has been talking about so consistently, I think that Dr. Jaishankar could emphasize the fact that the sustainable development goals financing gaps have to be closed for developing countries, because the problems really exist in the developing countries which don't have the means to finance their objectives. So there will be emphasis on that. Of course, they will talk about how global peace is being disturbed, the issues relating to the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas war, what the United Nations should do and where it has failed. So I think it will be a very comprehensive speech.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Such a pleasure to have three very distinguished guests on the show. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Rao. And thank you, Chitra ji, for taking out time for this special broadcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's it in this special broadcast on Prime Minister Narendra Modi's address to Summit of the Future at the United Nations headquarters in New York. It was a very succinct and brief address, but a very relevant one considering the challenges of present times and the future. He spoke on sustainable development, on counterterrorism, on UNSC reform, on the interplay between technology, ethics and regulation, and of course on other challenges as well. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for watching this special broadcast. Namaskar.